Hello, we're about to start our webinar looking at reducing the risk of fraud, crucial to any AP department. We'll have a couple of headlines from the latest research from IFOL. People, I hope, are just joining us now, so we'll start in just a couple of moments. Meantime, if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, we can see exactly where you are now. That's just before we get started. Get going in a few moments. Okay, so a big welcome. Today's webinar is identifying 3 of the main controls and the areas in which you need to put them in place to reduce the risk of fraud in AP. We'll be providing you with a guide following the session, so there's no need to make any notes. If you have any questions as we go along, please put them in the chat and we'll do our best to pick them up. I'm Sue Beardsmore, and today I'm joined by 2 of our experts. Deborah R. Richardson, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Deborah.
All right, thank you, Sue. So I am Deborah R. Richardson. I am a certified fraud examiner, a CFE, and a certified accounts payable professional, that CAP certification from IFOL. But I provide vendor process training and content to avoid fraud, regulatory fines, and just overall bad vendor data to both the AP and the vendor team professionals that still have a manual process. And we know they're still out there.
We'll be talking about that a bit later on. And Richard Ransom's also with us from Bottom Line. Richard, a bit about you and Bottom Line.
Hi, thank you, Sue. Thank you, Deborah. So I head up solution consulting for Bottom Line in EMEA and APAC. I've got about 25 years of experience in payments and payment processes. I've got a collection of war stories and an interest in improving controls and reducing fraud and error in AP. So I also work closely with colleagues in North America to keep up to date with changing fraud patterns as check moves to ACH and wire, something that happened in the UK sort of 20 years ago, and where real-time payments is becoming a reality. I have to also mention that Bottom Line's name is derived from the routing details at the bottom of the check. So we started out in check fraud prevention way back 25, 30 years ago.
Thanks very much indeed, Richard. So we're looking at the critical concerns facing AP leaders. It's a complex financial landscape for organizations to navigate, and global transactions and tech used for all the wrong reasons are making things even tougher. We'll look at the main areas of concern that have been identified by AP leaders and IFOL members and look at effective strategies to deal with them. Our 2024 accounts payable fraud research on AP fraud, 65%, a shocking statistic, 65% of finance teams know a victim of AP fraud in the last 5 years. And 38%, that's over a third, have experienced false or non-existent shell companies sending in invoices, sometimes with catastrophic effects. So they're pretty shocking, but I guess you 2 are both nodding. That's kind of what you expect to hear?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so the 3 broad areas we'll be exploring. Who are you making payments to? And the red flags raised by exceptions and the reliability of the vendor master file. So if we could, let's start with a quick poll, and I'd ask you all to join in this if you wouldn't mind. Poll number 1. So, how do you confirm payee details before making a payment? It's a multiple choice. Confirmation of payee technology solution, a phone call to the payee, an email to the payee, you request banking details on letter-headed paper, you do more than one of the above, or you do none of those regularly. So many things there that you can be doing. So confirmation of pay technology solution, a technological solution, a phone call to a payee, an email to a payee. Do you request banking details on letter-headed paper? You do more than one of the above, or you do none of them regularly. So if you could join in that, and we'll look at it as soon as we have some results up there.
Yeah, I know which one I want to see as the highest percentage. We'll see.
Okay, so here's a result up. Let's have a look. So Well, we've got a good crowd in today because they do more than one of the above, which I'm sure you will approve of. And some do none of the things regularly. So that's quite an interesting thing. Some technology solution, 14%, phone call, 21%, email, 21%, request banking details, 21%, more than one thing, 50%, and none of them regularly, 21%. So let's start chatting about that, shall we? So what do you think about those results? Deborah.
All right, so I'll start. So number one, that the more than one of the above, the 50%, that's the one I was rooting for, because if you have a manual process, it is just getting too hard out here. And the technology tools that the fraudsters are using that some of us just don't have access to yet, that's helping them to perpetrate fraud on us. So not one, there's no silver bullet out there. The confirmation call is not a silver bullet, right? Collecting the vendor banking on vendor letterhead or banking letterhead is not a silver bullet anymore. You really need to have a combination of controls in place if you still have that manual process. One of which is you need to make sure that you are not changing vendor remittance details based on an invoice. You really need your own customized ACH wire form to collect the vendor banking. And when you're collecting that, make sure you're collecting authenticating data that you can take from that form and confirm that the data you're asking for matches what's already on your vendor master file. So if you have a bank change request, ask them for the existing banking information, ask them for their tax ID, ask them for the internal employee they have a relationship with, right? Put those obstacles in the way that's going to make that fraudster go on to the next potential victim that's not asking those types of questions.
So I know that when we were talking previously, you mentioned that you have 5 authentications, 29 internal controls, 17 best practices, 16 vendor validations, and like a 6-step process. Could you explain, Deborah, why what you said, there's no silver bullet, you need to do more things. Why is that now? What should people be looking out for in this manual kind of world?
So, and not only is it not a silver bullet as to, one thing that they can do that's going to just make sure and take care of fraud, because if it was, there would be no fraud. There's also not a silver bullet process because everyone is different. So that's why I have the 5 authentication techniques, 29 internal controls, 17 best practices, and 16 vendor validations. Because what they really need to do is look at their entire P2P process and put those things in to plug up the gaps. That's what really needs to happen when you have that manual process.
Okay. Richard, talk us through a little bit some of the technological solutions.
Yes, great. And I think to add to what Deborah was saying, that confirming of pay details is really key, especially talking to someone you know. I think don't trust inbound emails or headed paper, as Deborah said. I think one fraud that we found out about locally to us here in the UK, a school was defrauded on a single invoice of £350,000. That's about $450,000. As an email from a fake domain with a similar name to the defrauded school was sent. So they changed a .co.uk. They just set one up in a .net, able to send an email. The next payment to the account went to the fraudster's account instead. So easy to change those things. So that's why you need protection. So something like confirmation of payee, which is a service in the UK now, and it's coming to other countries as well. So we know Australia have just announced the winner of a bid for that. We know across Europe these services are coming out as well. So confirmation of payee in UK does a live check of the ownership of an account. So you give it a sort code, an account number, and an account name, and it will send a message off to the banks in the UK, and they will come back and say, yes, that is a valid account, and that sort code account number belongs to that name. It will also tell you whether that account belongs to a business or a person. So we know these checks are very important in the UK, especially because our banking systems aren't very good at checking that account ownership. I'll talk about it in a bit more detail later, but a German motor manufacturer was defrauded for over £6 million, so $7.5 million, due to an internal party, so an authorized party acting fraudulently internally, just updated the details of a vendor with the sort code and account number details of vendor with their own sort code and account number details, no special mule account, nothing bought on the dark web, just his normal bank account, and then managed to commit fraud. So that's the UK. It's a great service because it allows that live check on data. Now, in the US, we know situations slightly different. Organizations are moving from check into ACH or wires, and services like Paymode, which is a bottom line services, other services like that are available. Paymode takes away the pain of verifying the buyer and supplier details with both parties. So the buyer doesn't have to hold supplier bank information. So we know that's it's culturally very different, but that is a great help against fraud in these services. So if you don't have to control that within your own organization, someone else is doing that for you, that can really help reduce fraud. And I think on that US point, again, I spoke to one of my colleagues who was at a conference last week, speaking to a $12 billion revenue company. They're paying about 20 to 25,000 checks a month, which is a huge amount, I know, but their fraud is escalating. So in FY22, they had 15 incidents of fraud, and in December alone last year, they had 13. So more in the last 6 months than the last 3 years combined. So these checks are really key, and managing that detail and making sure that no one can check and no one can change that information. You can check it and you are in control of that.
Okay. Deborah, do you want to add anything to that? Maybe what's going on in the States?
Yeah, so Richard brought up the check fraud that has just exploded since the pandemic, right? And I've heard that the reason for that here in the US is all the checks that went out, right? All those stimulus checks, and now the fraudsters are right on that. So make sure there's some controls you put in place, but one is really key. So when you say positive pay, that's great, but make sure you have positive payee pay, right, for your checks, so that if a check is presented, your bank is not just looking at the account, the amount and the date, but they're also looking at the payee. And sometimes you can say positive pay, but you don't realize that it's not payee positive pay. So make sure you check that.
Okay, and I know that you've talked about, and we'll go on to it a bit later, but just to mention at the moment that deep fake is helping people to defraud people by things that you would expect to work, like a phone call or seeing somebody online, and people are just making stuff up.
Yeah, they are. So with that confirmation call, Rich talked about that too. You still need to have a combination, but when you make that confirmation call, or you perform that confirmation, right, of the banking or any type of a change, make sure you initiate it, not them contacting you. So you initiate it, and then you do that confirmation. And within that confirmation, have some authentication in that too, right? To make sure you're not contacting a fraudulent number or a fraudulent person. But there are, right, still additional things that you can do to make that confirmation call more successful, and then surround it with other controls, especially with that manual process, so you can avoid the fraud that's out there.
Richard, do you have anything to add at that point?
No, I think Deborah's rounded it off really nicely there. I think it's a really important.
Yeah, so you're talking about very careful processes, but of course we know that people can put the processes in place, but they have to be stuck to, like, all the time. Is that catching people out? They think they've got the processes, but sometimes people just simply don't use them. Have you come across examples of that and things for people to look out for?
So I have, and that's mainly, so if you, let's say you're, you're in the vendor team, but you're not necessarily one that's making that call. So the assumption is that whoever is assigned to do it is making it and making it all the time. And when they make it, they're not calling the, communication or the telephone number that's in the requester's email, right? So that doesn't always happen, and the call doesn't always happen. So you need to put some processes in place behind it, like auditing, to make sure that they're following the processes that you put into place. Because sometimes, it's hard to get that vendor on the phone, and that it can be missed, right? Not followed up on. And so you do need to put processes like an audit in place to make sure it's done.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And you can have all the process in the world. You have a 17-step process. At the end of that, if you were just relying on one person to enter those vendor details into your ERP or other store of master data, if they aren't being audited, checked, and there aren't approvals around that, then you've sort of blown that whole process. So there needs to be really strong control around that part of it as well.
Richard, people that you come across, businesses, teams that you're coming across, everybody, I guess, understands that fraud is increasing rapidly. But do they realize, how many steps ahead the fraudsters are and what they might need to do? Do they know that there's this big gap that they have to catch up to?
No, and often people are just focused on their part of the process. So if you're bringing in AP automation, for example, you're not going to be particularly interested in the payment end where a lot of the fraud could happen. You're not going to be particularly interested necessarily in how the vendor master data is put in place. But all of these things have to be looked at together. You have to look at that complete end-to-end process. And unless a fraud is perpetrated upon the organization, they may not think about those risks or just believe those risks have been mitigated somewhere in the process, just not, in their piece, everything's perfect and they've just got good data in and out. They'll just crack on with their job.
Okay. Right, before we move on to a quick poll about exceptions, anything we've missed, anything you'd like to add about this confirming who your payees are? Or good to go?
I think we're good to go.
Yeah.
Okay, so another poll, please. Would you join in, everybody? Oh, I think I should just say before we do the poll that IFOL has a fraud prevention specialist certification course. So we're covering things briefly today, but if you do want to find out more in detail, that's always a possibility. Okay, let's have a look at exceptions. What percentage of your B2B payments are outside of the usual AP process? And this is just a single choice, just an estimate, just to give us an idea. None. You have no exceptions to what should be going on. 1 to 10%, 11 to 20%, 21 to 40%, 41 to 60%, over half, or 61% plus, by which time I guess you're tearing your hair out. There's nothing sensible there. Okay, so what percentage of your B2B payments are outside of the usual AP process? And we'll talk about what they might be in a minute, but in your estimation, doing this poll, 0%, 1 to 10%, 11 to 20%, 21 to 40%, 41 to 60, so around about the halfway mark, or more than 61%.
Sue, I know you know which one I want this time.
Do you think that's likely, Deborah?
Rich?
Yeah,
I haven't come across any teams where that really, really happens, but we'll see what's happening. Okay, wow, there you are. There you go, to the top of your class. We've got some with no percent. 1 to 10 is the usual. 11 to 20, 21 to 40, just 6%. But so 1 to 10%, 71%. And I'm delighted to say that we don't go higher than up to 40%, and that could be as low as 20%. Is that, from the companies, the teams that you come across, is that what you'd expect, really, that there's a few here and there?
So for me, the teams that I come across is probably a little higher because those are the ones that have probably had a fraud. But the percentages as they were is what I like to see. And that 1 to 10%, that was 71%. I'm hoping 69% were 1%, with the other 2% higher. But I think that is very important because fraudsters really use our behavior tendencies against us. There are 9 cognitive biases that the fraudsters exploit, one of which is authority bias, right? So that's when they send an email from some C-suite or someone that we all just want to impress, right? Because we want to look good, we want our raises, we want to do a great job. But that email is asking you to make a payment, right, outside of your normal process. But if you do have controls in place, if you have plugged up your gaps that only allows, right, payments or changes to remittance information to go through your regular process, then that will stop that fraud in its tracks. So I understand that we all live in a real world and there are escalations, there are urgent requests, but find a way to not throw those things that you're doing to protect your company out of the window just because there's an urgent request. You can still do all your processes that you put into place. Just move it up in the queue, for example, right? Find a way to have that happy medium because you don't want the fraudsters to take advantage of our natural tendencies, right, to please the boss or anything else that might or anyone else that might try to put that that request outside of your normal process.
Okay, because I guess you talk about authority bias, but one of the things that must be very difficult is that sense of urgency about things as well. I mean, that's when lots of things get thrown out the window because you want to get it done. Presumably that creates problems as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Richard, yeah, what would you like to add?
Well, I think just to echo what you were saying at the IFOL conference last week in London, I think one of the panelists mentioned that this stress might happen at the end of a month or the end of a financial period. And that's when a lot of these frauds happen because people are pushed into those processes. I think just to carry on from what Deborah was saying, those controls are really important. And sometimes, you know, I'm really interested in the controls at the payment end because they often get forgotten. And when I look at a typical business's payment process, their normal domestic payments will sit in one particular process, which will be a file coming out of an ERP. There'll be possibly 4 eyes on that process before that file is let out of the business. As soon as you introduce a cross-border payment or a high-value payment or a payment that needs to be done immediately, they'll go away from their normal payment channel and they'll go into the manual entry into e-banking. And that's a massive air gap there. So you're giving someone the opportunity to type in a sort code and account number or routing data that will push the payment to a fraudulent body. And that, especially when you've been given that instruction by someone senior from your business, you're under stress, we need to get this payment made, that gets typed, you know, that gets typed in. So there's a best practice there around making sure that none of your payments are entered manually into your banking system. So whether you're in UK and using BACS or whether you're using an e-banking solution or a payment hub, everything should just be data that comes from your ERP. And I know it's very difficult for teams to sometimes refuse to do something for someone senior, that stress, but those processes are there obviously for a reason, and building in other processes as well around automation can help on that as well. So all no PO, no pay, no exceptions, that can really help to reduce those fraud levels. So
And have you seen it do that?
Yeah, absolutely reducing fraud, and we especially see it with in the US with our pay mode solution. I'm not here to talk about bottom lines products, but it's just that control over the vendor and the buyer details means that you get a nearly fraud-free process just because you've managed to build more approval in at either end of the process, and you're removing the air gaps and the opportunity for someone to type something in error, or because someone has told them to do that, and that detail is fraudulent.
Yeah.
You mentioned, I think, previously, sort of gaps in technology that create problems. Are there occasions when people think something is being looked after and is safe, but actually it's not, and they need to do more around the processes that they think they've got?
Yeah, I think so. One area that we often see is that people think putting anything into e-banking is a safe process, and printing, saving a file from their ERP and then uploading that into a browser is safe because they've had all eyes on it, and they've seen the file, they've uploaded it. There's a there's a login to be done with e-banking, but that's also an opportunity for someone to manipulate data. The data is often held in plain text in the network. So those air gaps are really easy to exploit if you know what you're doing, especially if there's collusion. So if you know a DBA, or you know someone in on the IT side who can help you get access to a secure folder, for example, you can change the data and manipulate it to the point where someone will feel that they're uploading the right thing. But the fact that it's banking doesn't mean it's safe all the time.
Okay.
And I would also say, in your accounting system or ERP, right? Some things you don't think about is the security and following least privilege access. And I will tell you, as a practitioner, it was 2 years before I found out that the purchasing team had the ability to change our contact page in the vendor master file, right? So you really have to look at those roles, who has access to what, because if you have all this training to try to avoid fraud, you know what to put in, you know what not to give out, you know not to, reveal sensitive information. That does no good if they can call Helpful Susie down, in another department, and she has access to all that sensitive information too. So those are the types of things that you really need to be looking at doing that security audit, and doing it on a recurring basis to make sure you know who has access to your vendor data and who doesn't. Because I know Rich talked a couple of times about employees making changes, those internal fraudsters making changes to remittance information. Make sure that you've taken that away from people that absolutely don't need to have that access to your vendor master file.
Okay. Anything to add, Richard? Okay. Let's go on to a specialist subject, Deborah, vendor master file, and let's do a poll around this. Okay. How often do you and your team review the vendor supplier master file? Single choice, do you do it monthly, quarterly, biannually, annually, or never, or not regularly? Let's not say you never do it, but not regularly. Oh, I see that you've got people who know. Okay, all right. So this is the question. This is the poll. Thank you for joining in them. How often do you review the vendor supplier master file? Monthly, quarterly, biannually, annually, or never? I'll give you a couple of moments to look at that and make your choice and see what we come up with. And we'll have the result. I'm guessing well, maybe I don't know what you're rooting for this time, Deborah.
You do.
You do. You have to tell us the optimum choice. Let's see. I think the results are in. Okay, so monthly 6%, quarterly 11%, biannually 11%, annually 44%, and never 28%. Okay, Deborah, you kick us off on this. Are you surprised by that? And which one were you rooting for?
not at all surprised. The numbers are exactly as I typically see when I work with accounts payable and vendor teams. Now, I will tell you, I was rooting for monthly. I get it. Cleaning the vendor master file, and especially a big part of that is inactivating vendors that you no longer use, that you haven't had activity with in 15, 18, 24 months, whatever threshold works for your company, right? You inactivate those vendors, because the less active vendors you have in your vendor master file, the less vendors that are susceptible to both internal or external fraud. Now, I do recommend that it be done on a monthly basis, because part of that master review process is not just inactivating vendors, but also revalidating the active vendors, or remaining active vendors, just to make sure none of their information has changed, because they won't always reach out to you and tell you something has changed unless it affects their payments. And that includes like the sanctions list and the watch list, because those lists are not static. And technically, with most of those lists, you are not supposed to pay vendors that appear on the list. So if a vendor is subsequently added to a list after you onboard them or after you checked them last and you've made a payment, now your company can be susceptible to fines. So that's why I say monthly. It's best to have like a continuous monitoring. But if you don't have that, the next best thing is to do that on a monthly basis.
People will say to you, Deborah, that is a big task every month. What would you say to them? What does it really involve? And actually, does it cut down if you do it monthly rather than waiting to do it annually, for example?
I'm glad you said that. It does cut it down if you do it monthly, because yes, there will be vendors that will fail validations that you'll have to reach out to and get updated information, but you wanted to know that ASAP. And there may be vendors that appear on the watch list, and now you have to go to leadership and say, what do we need to do? Because we've got invoices that need to be paid, but they're on this watch list. So that needs to be handled as well. But I do recognize that many of the people that are attending or watching this, their vendor master file cleanup process is totally manual. I get that. You do need to try to find, if your process is still manual, you don't have any AP automation products available to you, there are other platforms that you can take a look at to do bulk uploads. That'll do that for your tax registration number validation, for your watch list validation. So there are some separate tools out there. It's still a manual process, but if you do it on a monthly basis, that can go down to days, right? And you're not doing it all day. You're just doing the validations, and then you're going back and getting the results, and then following up with the vendors that do not pass validation. So it is something key that needs to be done.
Richard, would you like to jump in here?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is an area that we see time and time again. I just spent a little bit of time today revisiting some of my favorite fraud stories, all of which would be prevented by a monthly check on vendor data. So obviously I've mentioned confirmation of payee, and that is a service that could be used to scan your vendor data on a monthly basis, on a regular basis in bulk. So just making sure sort code, account number, and the business name still match according to UK bank details, and no one has put their own sort code and account number details in. So we've seen £1.5 million fraud, so nearly $2 million from a scrap metal company that was perpetrated over several years with a fake vendor that had been set up by someone in the accounts team. A charity defrauded nearly $600,000 over 7 years due to, once again, a vendor in an account system. But the one example I tend to use at a lot of conferences and talk about this in terms of what we've just been trying to illustrate and articulate was a motor manufacturer in the UK. So a long-term finance employee realized that there might be a way for him to make a bit of extra money. So he took the examples. There was a vendor that they hadn't used for a while. It was a security company, ironically, and he put his own sort code and account number in it. So they were using a world famous ERP for this process. So he managed to change those details. He sent himself, he sent an invoice in the name of that company that he'd created himself into the company system under the value he knew would be missed by any exception processing, and the first invoice got paid. So he kept repeating this process on a monthly basis, and he managed to do it 59 times before eventually the auditor spotted it 3 years later. So £6 million, so $7.6 million stolen from a world famous company, just lacking one control. And if they had regularly reviewed their supplier master file and looked for personal bank details in business where business bank details should have been, they could have stopped it immediately, or even had that long-term finance employee known that these controls were in place, he would not have tried that particular fraud. So he managed to buy himself a diving school in the Caribbean with that money 59 times. So he wasn't spotted by friends, by colleagues. He had a lavish lifestyle, which he kept secret from all those people. But it's a sobering thought that someone could get away with that. Now, a coda to that story is that that organization were actually sued by their bank for another 4.4 million because they let that happen to their business. So that's, it's an extreme story, but it happened.
Yeah, an extreme story, but one check and not an elaborate fraud.
No,
I mean, one man, Deborah.
Yeah, and once again, he didn't have to go on the dark web to buy an account. He just used his own bank account. The fraud worked, so he just carried on doing it. The bank didn't stop it.
Okay.
But
I don't know if you want to jump in, Deborah. I've got a couple of questions actually that would be good to. So one about this particular subject, and then one that came earlier that I'll go to. So when you're checking your vendors, is it their bank account info that you're checking and mailing address for checks? And I think this is from someone in the US, Deborah. So maybe you'd like to have a go at that.
Well, whether you're in the US, non-US, wherever you are, you do need to validate your vendor information. And when I say that, I mean validating the tax ID. And it's not just the IRS, EIN or SSN or ITIN. Other countries have other business, individual sales tax numbers that you can validate. So it's that vendor registration number is what I call it, but it's also the address, making sure that it's in the right format and that it's mailable, and making sure that it's still mailable, right? Because addresses can become inactive. They can also become vacant. So you want to check that. You also want to make sure you're checking. I'm glad Richard brought that up. Not just, right, the fact that the vendor still owns that bank account, but you want to check the sort code, the routing number, because banks merge and get acquired all the time. And vendors never tell you when that happens. But here in the US, especially if you send that through in your pay file one too many times, the banks are going to get mad for changing it, right? So it can be successful. Then you're going to have a NACHA violation. So you do want to check that as well. And then check anything else that maybe your company does. A lot of companies will collect insurance certificates, right? So you need to check those as well. So it's not just the tax registration number, it's the addresses, it's the bank information, the bank branch information, the bank account ownership information, and it's also the watch list again. So whatever your company collects for your vendor that's able to be validated, you need to validate it on a regular basis.
Richard, do you want to add anything in there, how people may go about that? You're on mute. Sorry.
the cardinal sin of webinar. Apologies.
Come on, do it.
So yeah, I think I can't comment much more on Deborah's very comprehensive answer on those areas. I think we also talked about that activity and non-activity. Where are they still in an active vendor? It's yeah, you have to do as much as possible. That's it's simple as that. Opportunity makes a thief, so you have to make sure you've got all those areas closed down.
Well, we're coming towards the end, so let's get this question in. It was from our first section, really, about who you're paying. From the UK point of view, does the confirmation of pay as well work with foreign bank accounts? So we're talking about those global transitions.
It's just UK accounts at the moment, but as I said, we're seeing, I think in the Netherlands they've also got a service. We're seeing these services open out. Swift will introduce something for global account details as well. That will confirm the IBAN, that international bank account number, and account ownership to a degree as well. So yes, the world's waking up to this, and we're seeing much more protection around that data.
Okay, just one question. Well, unless you think we've missed anything in this gallop through what people should be looking out for and doing, anything you want to add to anything we've said so far? No.
So I have one. So I liked Richard's example about the 59 times that internal employee. I mean, I didn't like it, but yes, I've seen that. And there's a great example of that is available on a documentary from in the US. And this is from the city of Dixon, which was Ronald Reagan's, our former president's hometown. There is a documentary, it's on Netflix, and it just got to Prime, Amazon Prime, and it's called All the Queen's Horses. It's about an hour and 10 minutes long. Check that out. That will surprise you as well for how long and how she was able to get away with that for over 20 years, I think it was.
Wow. Final question, I think, from the people who've joined us. Is there a company you recommend to work with to check bank details before they're part of the vendor data bank and when they're part? I think there's going to be an answer to this, maybe typed. I'm not sure.
So that's a little more complex. It really depends on what country the person, what company their country, or what country their company is set up in, what countries their vendors are in, because there are several providers out there that can do bank account ownership validation, but it really depends on what countries you need. And so that's a little more complex. It might be something I'd be happy to follow up with if I can just get a couple more questions answered.
Okie doke. Right. So the company's worldwide and vendors are worldwide. So big project. Okay.
And every company is unique. Remember, there's no silver bullet process or silver bullet end to end that's going to fit everyone. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, we're just about to the end. Anything you want to add? Anything I've missed? I mean, fraud increasing, but are the pair of you, do you think it is possible to fight it?
So I think increasingly are using us, and I haven't said this before, but using ourselves as a human firewall is just not going to work going into the future. We're going to have to look at AP automation, some AI processing. We need some help on our side to fight what the fraudsters are using AI to do to defraud us. And so I think that's where we're going. Using ourselves as a human firewall, I think that's going to not be doable in the near future. And we're probably there now, but there's some things we can still put into place.
Richard?
Yeah, I think the fraudsters are always a couple of steps ahead of where we are. So we're just plugging this particular gap and another opportunity comes out. So we know in the UK, check fraud was prevalent in accounts payable and people moved away from checks. So then the fraud became more like changing vendor details. So that insider fraud, and people learn how to do those things. So check fraud's gone away. We're not suffering from that particularly anymore. However, there's just completely different types of fraud coming out. As Deborah said, we don't understand or know what they are at the moment because people are very clever.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks very much on that sobering thought. Good luck to everybody out there. Thanks to Richard Ransom from Bottom Line and Deborah R. Richardson. And thanks to you for joining us. For more information on membership and courses, please head to the IFOL website. And this webinar will be available on demand on the IFOL website from tomorrow. So please share with anyone you think may find it useful. We'll send links and best practice guide out shortly. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.